Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Άνω Lιόσια, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. We continue with the game suggested to me by my Facebook friends, and it is a turn of my Facebook friend Achilleos Zographos. After we presented one of his games, he requested that I present two games by his friend George Sιώρης, that unfortunately has died since. And in this video, we'll present the first of these two games. The game took place in Άνω Λιόσια, a neighborhood of Athens, in the year 1993, and George Sιώρης was facing an international master, Panagiotis Pantavos. When they played, Panagiotis Pantavos had a rating of 2360. Since then, it has fallen a little bit to 2120. George Sιώρης, the last time we had any rating change of him in the FreeTech database was in the year 2009, when his rating was 2225, and unfortunately the FreeTech database goes only until the year 2000, when his rating was 2223, just 2 points below. The international master, Panagiotis, or Takis, his name, Pantavos, had the white pieces, and George Sιώρης the black. But before we start, I'm going to read for you a brief biography of George that was listed with the score sheet, and I'm going to translate from Greek. George Sιώρης was a very strong player with a creative and combative style of game. He would not sacrifice material in order to have active pieces, as we'll see below in this next game against international master Takis Pantavos. George was a federal metro, meaning chess master, and the first chessboard of the chess club Ampelokipi. And his greatest success was once in the decade of 90s, he got a first place in an open tournament. He was especially loved in the chess, let's call it the place, so chess lieu, for his politeness, his humor, and his broader culture. He had studied English literature, and he had a special love to literature, poetry, philosophy, music, and cinema. And we are going now to start the game. Let's share the screen. And here we are. This is the chessboard of chess.com, and as always, what we'll do is we'll enter move by move from the score sheet, the moves on the board, and the computer will tell us the evaluation. On the left side here, you'll see the chessboard after every move. On the right side, you will see what does the computer think. Positive number means white is doing better, negative that black is doing better, while the computer will tell us what does he think about this move, if it was the best move, if not, which move would have been the best, and what are the 5 top moves for the player whose turn is to come. As we mentioned, George Sιώρης, for whom we dedicate this video, is with the black pieces. And his opponent, Takis Pantavos, the international master, starts sending the pawn to e4, and George replies pawn to c5, Sicilian defense. And you can see here where it says Sicilian defense. Now, every little in a while, you'll see we're going to stop the game, and I'm going to translate to you the comments written in the score sheet. The comments were written in Greek, and of course, I'll translate them into English. Next move. Takis sends his knight to f3, and George his pawn to d6. And then Takis sends his pawn to d4. These are standard moves of the Sicilian. We exchange on d4. And after the knight takes on d4, then it's called not Sicilian defense any longer, but Sicilian defense, the open variation. And usually when you deal with a knight on f3, it's the open. If you deal with a knight on c3, it's a closed variation. Pawn to a6 for... I'm sorry. This is the next move. Now, knight to f6 for George, attacking the pawn on e4, which Takis will defend with his knight on c3. And George is afraid of a white knight landing on b5. That's why he completes a fifth move by sending the pawn to a6. We completed the first 5 moves, all of them book moves, and white has a small advantage of 0.50 just because he started first. But we are in the book moves. And let's see what do the notes say about the fifth move of black. The Sicilian knight dwarf, which was the beloved weapon of George against the first move e4 of white. And let's continue the game. Bishop to g5 for Takis, and pawn to e6 for George. You see now, by playing the pawn to e6, black self-pins the knight on f6. Before it was not pinned, now it is pinned because the queen is behind on d8. But you do that because you want to continue development. If you're scared of pinning your knight, the bishop on f8 will stay there and will never be developed. Let's continue. Queen goes to d3 for Takis, and let's read again the notes, what they have to say. It is an interesting alternative to the much more common pawn to f4. Knight from b8 to d7 for George develops his other knight as well. And by doing so, the queen can leave d8, and if Takis takes a knight on f6, then George will take back with the knight on f6 and not have to use his pawn on g7 and double his pawns. But on the other side, the bishop on c8 is completely blocked from both possible squares it could reach, pawn b7, knight d7. And this is the seventh and the move of black and the last book move. From now on, the players are on their own. And Takis pushes his pawn to f4, but computer says this is an inaccuracy, and that is why from now on, at least at this point, black is ahead. You see the minus 0.40. And Joe decides to attack along the queen side. Pawn goes to b5, which Takis wants to stop by placing his pawn on a3, and bishop to b7 for George, and by doing so, he has developed his bishop to b7, and the bishop is fianchettoed, meaning it controls the long diagonal that goes all the way from a8 to h1. It's wonderful if you can place your bishops on these two long diagonals, especially as little by little the board is emptying. The control is great. And Takis will place his bishop on e2. And George places his bishop on e7, and so the knight on f6 is not pinned any longer. We completed the first 10 moves, and now George with black is ahead by 0.48, a very small advantage. But as I have said often, better you have it than your opponent. Continue now, bishop to f3, not the king, the bishop goes to f3 for Takis, and that's, by doing so, challenges the control of the a8, h1 diagonal. Both sides have the light colored bishops on the long a8, h1 diagonal. Queen to c7 for George, so that if for any reason Takis is able to use his f3 bishop to take the one on b7, then George can take back with his queen on c7 and not be a piece down. Long side castling for Takis. Rook to c8 for George. Computer thinks inaccuracy, but what black is trying to do is exert pressure on the c file as it's semi-open because there are no black pawns, only the white c2 pawn, because the white king is on c1. King to b1 for Takis. When you have castled a queen side, you want, if possible, to move your king from the c file to the b file, at least most of the times. You don't want suddenly a queen landing on a2, for example, and checkmating on a1 sometime. And of course, you don't like the fact that rook c8, queen c7 are along the c file, At least let's have the king out of the c file. Kingside castling for George, and now both sides have castled opposite sides. And as we know from chess theory, this means that the two sides will start throwing pawns to each other, trying to open the king's defenses, to destroy the king's defenses, and usually whoever is the first one to land on the other side is the winner. Next move, pawn to g4 for Takis, and let's see what the notes have to say at this point. A very sharp variation has emerged with two sides playing with opposite castling. The plans can be nothing else but an attack towards the king. And knight to c5 for George that attacks white queen on d3. Mistakes is a computer, but white Takis will have to spend a move saving the queen instead of doing anything else. Otherwise, for example, Takis might want to throw the pawn from h2 to h4. And of course, it's nice to attack, but it's even better to save your queen. That's what Takis is doing. Queen goes to e3. And knight to a4 is for George. And let's see what do the comments have to say. A typical move of the Najdorf variation. Najdorf, by the way, is named after an Argentinian grandmaster whose last name is Najdorf, and he became very famous by writing the book My System that explains a lot of things about his chess way of thinking. And Najdorf is one of the strongest players never to become the world champion, but he was close many times. Now, the comments say the following. It is a typical move in the Najdorf variation. The blacks ignore or don't care about their pawn structure because they're trying to open lines. And of course, as we understand, this is the case because if the knights are exchanged, yes, it's true that George will have double pawns a6, a4, but the open b file is great, and especially the queen being able to land on the c2 square. Currently, he cannot because of the knight on d4, but if the knight on d4 is removed, and what black will try to do is to throw the pawn to d5. If it's taken from to e5, I'm sorry, if it's taken from f4, the d6 will take on e5, the white knight will be forced to move, and then the black queen can take on c2. That is the plan of George. But of course, Takis will not allow him, even though the computer says, yes, the best thing for white is to exchange on a4 and then continue with h4. But Takis prefer to put his rook on d3. Good is a computer, but not the best, because if there is an exchange, if the knight on a4 takes on c3, now the rook will take back, attack the queen on c7, and after it moves, even take the rook on c8, and black's attack becomes less powerful. Otherwise, even if the white knight on c3 does not take on a4, then you could have the knight on a4 taking on c3, queen takes back, queens are exchanged, and then the black rook takes a pawn on c3, black is a pawn ahead and ready for a strong attack, because then the other rook will come to c8, and so on. But that's not going to happen because of actually the rook, white rook going to d3. Instead, the black rook will go from f8 to d8. Takis places his other rook to e1 to help the queen on e3. Computer says it is a mistake. In fact, if you see after the previous move of black, rook to e1 does not even show as any of the top 5 moves of white. And so you see that white's advantage has fallen from 0.86 to 0.02, and computer says that rook to e1 is a mistake. Pawn to h6 for George, and now Takis has basically two options. Either withdraw his bishop to h4 and continue the ping, or exchange on f6. And Takis decides to exchange on h6. And now Takis attacks on g5, so the pawn will exchange on g4 on the square g5, which after this exchange this helps white, helps Takis because we have semi-open files in front of the, especially the f1 in front of the black king, and it's much easier for white to send queens and rooks towards the black king. But in addition, now black has to deal with the bishop on f6 is attacked. Of course, the bishop cannot take on g5 because there's a queen on e3. The bishop can either go back to e7, or front to e5, or even exchange the knight on d4. Let's see what black decides to do. And the Takis exchanges on d4. But before we complete the exchange, this is the 20th move of black. And after every 5 moves, we start seeing what's happening. You see here that the computer believes the game is even, 0.00. Of course, materially, black, you may see it has a +3, but this means nothing because now the next turn, the white queen is going to take back on d4. See here, if black plays, so if white plays anything else, they are behind. And of course, the white queen takes on d4. The George places his queen on c5, hoping for a queen exchange, because the queen on d4 occupies a very powerful diagonal. The long diagonal from a1 to h8 threatens, not threatens exactly, exerts pressure on g7. Of course, currently there is a king on g8 that protects it, but if the pawn from h2 goes a4, h5, h6, things become very nasty whether black changes on h6 or not. Because we're going to have a white pawn on h6 and the queen on d4 is going to g7 mate. And in order to avoid this way ahead before it happens, black is not suggesting or inviting for exchange. I think white, Takis has no other move. Let's double check if this is true. Anywhere else where the queen can go, it's going to be lost. Of course, white has one more option, not to move the queen, and then the exchange will be then the on c5. But finally, Takis takes on c5, and now George has 3 ways to take it back on c5, either with the knight or from a4, or with the rook on c8, or with the pawn on d6. But George decides to use his knight. The reason being, first of all, you don't like your knight to be on the periphery of the board. As I say, knight on the rim is green and ready for the trim. So not to avoid such a possibility, you see that on a4 it could control only 4 squares, b6, c5, c3, and b2, while here on c5 it controls 8 squares, and in addition attacks the rook on d3. That is why Takis, instead of playing anything else, like for example pushing his pawn on h4, that's what he would love to do, he would first need to see how to deal with a rook. Rook goes to d2. Now, the problem with having 2 rooks on d2 and d1 is that, at least in theory, if a knight can land on f3, we are talking about a fork. Can attack both rooks and will win the exchange. But this is, for the time being, a pipe dream, because the knight will need at least 3 moves to make to f3. For example, d7, e5, and f3, and then f3. In the meantime, black can withdraw his bishop anywhere and have his bishop control the square f3. But if you are playing, you keep this in your back, in your mind, just in case the opportunity arrives. Let's see how the game will continue. If anything, George places his knight on d7, and this is the first out of the three moves that are needed to land the knight on f3, but computer thinks it's inaccuracy because clearly white is not going to allow black to just send the knight on f3. And in addition, we have some notes to read. You see that the pawn on d6 is going to be lost, is under danger. And let's see what the notes have to say. He's follow his style. George sacrifices a pawn in order to secure the square e5 for his knight, among other things. So this is the reason why George is sacrificing his pawn on d6, not because he overlooked it, or he got so excited with the possibility of landing the knight to f3 that he forgot about the pawn. No, that's not the case. And but the computer thinks that knight going to d7 is an inaccuracy. But Takis will take the pawn on d6, and the knight goes to e5. The second of the three moves that would be needed to land the knight on f3. And Taki is not going to let him. First of all, check on d8. So George has to deal with that. His rook takes on d8. Rook to d1 for Takis. And now the two rooks stare at each other. Here is a story. Black cannot use a knight on e5 to take the bishop on f3 because then rook from d1 takes rook on d8 and white has won the exchange. What is black going to do? What is George going to do? He decides to place his rook on c8. But now at this point, the bishop on f3 is under attack because if white, for example, moves his pawn to h4, then the bishop on f3 is lost and white is a piece down. Instead, Takis will place his knight on e2. Why e2 and not any other square where it could go? What's happening is that there are two squares between the bishop and the knight, and this is the ideal place for the bishop to challenge the knight. What do we mean by that? The knight on e5 can go at most to 8 squares. Of course, one of them, f7, is occupied by a pawn, but the knight can move to 7 different squares. But in 4 of them, the bishop can take the knight. To c4, it's going to be an exchange. If it goes to f3, g4, or d3, the bishop will just take the knight. So the knight either would need to stay on e5 or otherwise would have to go backwards. That's what George doesn't like, and that's why he's going for the exchange. Knight goes to c4. It's a very dangerous square to be. And that is why Takis removes it. We change on c4. Now, being a pawn upping material, you want to exchange material to reach possibly a winning ending. Still, there's no guarantee with an extra pawn you'll win, but the odds are much better. On the other side, what George has guaranteed is that he exchanged a bishop for a knight, and now we have the bishop on b7 versus the knight on c3. How will the game continue? Rook goes to d8 with a check for Takis. Unfortunately, there is no h7 pawn. There is no back rank, so George will place his king on h7, the only choice he had, basically. You see, king h7 is forced. Rook to d7 for Takis, threatening the bishop on b7, but the bishop has a nice square to go to e4. and by doing so, gets back the pawn he was behind. 30 moves, both players have exactly the same material, a rook, light piece, and 5 pawns. The computer says that white is ahead by 0.12, a very small advantage. If you see in the other categories, it is that you may see the following. First of all, white can take a pawn on f7, but on the other side, you see that black has a pawn on e6 that is passed, meaning there are no pawns on the d and f file that can stop it. That is a great advantage. So the more we go towards the end, the fewer the pieces of the board, the greater the advantage, because white can only stop it using his rook, knight, or king. Let's continue. We have an exchange on e4. And now Takis will once again be ahead by a pawn by winning the pawn on f7. But the plan is for George to push his e6 pawn to promotion if possible. By sending the rook on e1, although the computer thinks only the third best move, he wins the tempo, meaning the white king has to deal with that, and Takis can only send his king on a2. Not only wins the tempo, but the king is further from the action, from a2. And now the George threatens the white rook by sending the king to f7. Rook to a7 for Takis, threatens the pawn at a6. King takes to g5 for George, eliminates one pawn of white, so now both sides have king, rook, and 4 pawns. And next move. Rook to a6 for Takis. Now white is once again ahead by 1 pawn. But we see that passed pawn, the only passed pawn is the e6 pawn for George. What's happening is that the pawn at b5 blocks 3 white pawns, a3, b2, c2. And let's see, and now move that. But let's see what do we have in the notes after the 35th move of white. The position continues being even. And they say that because of the time control, white is going to lose a chance to win the game. But a draw would be a fair result. That's what the notes say at this point. A brief translation from Greek to English. King to f4 for black for George. And now let's see how things are going. Completed the first 35 moves. The computer thinks that the first 35th move of George is a mistake. And so Takis is ahead by 0.94. It starts being important. The more we go to the end, the more these little advantages become important. And let's see how things are going. Of course, Taki has 1 extra pawn, but George has the passed pawn from e6. What black wants to do, what George wants to do, is place his king somewhere like f1 or f2. So if the pawn from e6 can go to e2, then the black rook can leave e1, and even if white manages to have a rook on the e file, then the rook at most can take the pawn but sacrifice itself. So black will have an extra rook. That is the thought of black. How will the game continue? A very clever move for white. Taki sends his pawn to a4. Why? What are the alternatives of black? Not too many. If black forgets about it and plays something else, for example, moves the pawn to e5, then the white pawn goes to b5, and now it's going to become a very dangerous pass pawn 3 squares away from promotion, and the white rook doesn't have it very easy because they will need one move to go to, for example, e4 or e5, second to go to b4, b5. In the meantime, the pawn has advanced in the 6th rank and ready to continue, perhaps supported by the c pawn, and things are going to be tough, while the e6 pawn is still far away. If black accepts the challenge and exchange, if black, of course, pushes the pawn on b4, then the a4 automatically becomes a pass pawn. And if anything, the b4 pawn will block the white rook from stopping the white pawn. But actually, George accepted the challenge and exchanged on a4. Let's see what does this mean. It means that at this point, while before there was only one pass pawn for black a6, now white has two pass pawns, and if anything, two connected pass pawns. b2 and c2 then help and support each other and alone go all the way to promotion, while the king and the rook can do other things. Now this move is with a check. So George places the king on f3. We said that the king ideally should be in f2. Computer thinks a mistake, would rather have the king go on e3. And at this point, the advantage of white, George's advantage becomes significant. 2.13 at this part of the game is very important. What should white do is start pushing the b and c pawns, being next to each other, near each other, helping and supporting each other until one of them promotes. Perhaps might be lost, but will win the black rook as a very minimum. Let's see how the game continues. And yes, Takis pushes his pawn to b4, as expected. Rook to e2 for George to challenge the rook, not to challenge, to threaten two pawns, the c2 and the h2 pawn. Takis saves the more important c2 pawn because this is the one that needs to help the b pawn. And what can George do? Take the pawn on h2. So at this point, both sides have a king and rook and two pawns materially the same. Both sides have two pass pawns, b4, c2 for white, e6, g7 for black. But here is the difference. The b and the c pawns are next to each other on consecutive files, so they can help and support each other. But this is not the case for the e6 and g7 because there is the f file between them. That is why the white pawns are much stronger than the black ones. Let's see how game continues. Taki sends his pawn to b5 as planned, and what he could do later is even put the rook on b4, continue pushing the b pawn, and if the black rook is able to stop at, for example, b8, then we can have the c pawn started matching. That is white's plan. Black's plan is not so easy because you must choose which of the e and g file to start pushing. Maybe the g because it's more outside, but if the rook has to be on b8 to guard against the white pawns, only the king can help the g pawn. The king will have to waste one move to go to f2. So things for black don't look that easy, and that is before one does start doing the explicit calculation. Pawn to g5 for George, exactly as we said, start pushing, and ideally the g pawn. Why the g? Because it is further away from white's pieces, rook, king, and pawns. And so meaning it is not so easy to be blocked. We completed the first 40 moves, and the advantage of Takis with the white pieces is important. 2.29, meaning if Takis does not make a major mistake or blunder, the game is his to win. 2.29 advantage for white, as we said. I will continue. Let's see how the game will conclude. Rook to a7 for Takis, and let's see what the notes have to say. Wasting precious time, say the notes. Perhaps Takis has relaxed with the end of the pressure, believing that he is winning easily. And what does this mean? You see here, what do you mean by pressure? I believe they had a specific amount of time until the 40 moves, and then they got extra time, so there was less time pressure. So perhaps this may have made Takis relax. This is a mistake, says the computer. Why, for people of my rating and lower, it's not obvious to see. Why not have your rook on a7 and guarantee the 7th rank for the b5 pawn? It can go b6. B6 cannot be challenged. B6 because of the E6 pawn that's blocking the way. Then can go to B7. And it seems that this could be, and then you only have one more square to worry about. This might seem to be a good move, but the computer thinks it's a mistake. Would rather have the pawn directly going to B6. How does George react? Rook goes to H8, aiming to go to B8. And stopping the pawn, but the computer would rather have the rook go to H1, and then from H1, perhaps, let's see what would happen if it went to H1. Which one? C4, G4. So that's what the computer thinks. And let's see where we're now. Where would the rook go to H8? Computer thinks a miss, and while black, if had he set his rook on H1, he would be very near, just 0.64. Now white Takis is ahead by 2.51. And what does Takis do? He sends his rook on E7. If you saw before, it's just no, it's not even in the top 5 moves that are going to E7. Let's see what the notes have to say. You see, it's a miss. The advantage goes back to barely above 0, from 2.53 to 0.21. But we have some notes even from the previous move. Let's go back. The note after rook goes to H8 for black, the note says that the rook ending is anything but easy. And after the rook going to E7, it says, what the computer says, that after the only move pawn to C4, white is still winning. But this did not happen. Instead, George moved his pawn to G4. Rook took on E6. Maybe that's what Takis was hoping, win that pawn and only have to worry about the G pawn, but in the rook ending, sometimes the tempo is much more important than a pawn. And at this point, finally, George sends his rook on G8 to support the pawn on G4. And at this point, the two players agreed on a draw. You see, the computer says 0.00. What do the notes have to say? The notes say that it was a very combative game that highlights the optimistic and also fearless style of George. And what would happen if the players continued? Here you're going to see the continuation. Rook to f6 with a check, king to e2, rook to e6 with a check, king to f2, rook to a6, pawn to g3, rook to a1, pawn to g2. You see you have to count rook, king to c4, rook to c8 check. And here you'll see 20 moves later, we would end up in this position that's a draw, two kings facing each other. If anything, the two kings facing each other would appear from move number 58, 15 moves later. I'm not sure why the computer will play 5 more moves when it's only king versus king. But in any case, that would lead to a draw. And let's look now at the review of the game. What does the computer think about the game? You see here that the two players were more or less even until very late when White had a small advantage briefly, but they ended up in a draw. 87.7 percentage for Takis and 87.1 for George. They played as if their rating was 2350, which means basically the same as Takis. His was 2360 at the time, and a little bit higher for George, whose rating during all these years was a little bit more than 2200. And in the various categories, two great moves for George, best 18 versus 16 for Takis, excellent 6 versus 5 for Takis, good 2 versus 1 for Takis, book moves 7 each, inaccuracies 4 versus 3 for Takis, mistakes 4 versus 2 for George, and misses 4 versus 3 for George. This concludes the game, and we have one more game from George Sιώρης that we're going to present in the next video. But let's return to our tournaments. Let's see how things are going. grecochess, the one that I'm organizing. Nothing has changed. 8 games for the first round. From group 4, we have Barak 7, and from group 7, we have, from Israel, I'm sorry, and group 4, we have my skin from Italy have already advanced. Group 1, Maxim Govorukha from the Ukraine is leading 4 wins, 4 games, and the only one that can challenge is hunting achievement for France, but this player I checked on chess.com has not logged in since October 20 and still has about a couple of weeks of vacation remaining. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to see if Hunting Achievements will decide to play and challenge Maxim Govorukha, or if Maxim Govorukha will end up winning with a perfect score. And group 3, what's happening is myself, the Harry from Greece, and the Lion from Hungary. We have won 4 games against everybody else, and the 2 games between us will decide who is going to advance to the final round. That is about the grecochess tournament. And let's see the other one. The Moonlight Underwater Moonlight, the 9 Moons tournament. 9 groups. And let's see what's happening in all of them. We have more than half of the games of round 1 have been completed. Group 1, Lotus Time Chess leads with 11.5 points. Group 2, Spider 99 from Egypt, 11. Group 3, Zanilord, the organizer, and my my subscriber of the channel, Zanilord, leads with 10 points. Group 4, Iraq Lion from Iraq leads with 7 points. Group 5, Chinanfu from Greenland leads with 12 points. Group 6, Matis B 2008 from France leads with 12 points. Group 7, Jendalf 66 from Uzbekistan leads with 13 points. Group 8, I'm supposed to be leading with 6 points, but I have 6 wins and 7 losses, and the only reason why I'm ahead temporarily is because I played more games than the others. Google Ship Original from, let's see which country is that. From the European Union. He has a flag of the European Union. He has 5 wins and 4 losses. And let's see how this will continue, if I have any chances. And Group 9, after Hikaru Kalsenthal was his account closed for fair play violation, Lua 000 from Spain leads with 8 points. From every group, the top 3 players advance to the next round that should have 27 players, 9 times 3. I will continue informed about the tournaments. This concludes the presentation of the first game of George Sιώρης. The next video will have the second game that Achilleas Zographou suggested. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the viewers, to the subscribers. Thanks to the likes and the encouraging comments. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Άνω Λιόσια. This is grecochess. Goodbye.